Emily always remembered the story her parents told her about the fire when she was little. According to them, it had been a terrible accident, one that nearly took her life. The details were always the same. They'd say things like, "You were so lucky to have survived," or "It was a miracle you made it out." She could never forget the way her parents would tell the story with such emotion, as if they were reliving it. She had always accepted it as the truth, and even as she got older, she never questioned what they had said. There were pieces of the memory that stood out to her: flickering flames, the smell of smoke, and the overwhelming feeling of fear. But the images were blurry, and most of the time, they felt more like a dream than a real memory. Emily was very young when the fire happened, just a toddler, so it made sense that her memories were unclear. Her parents had told her she was too little to fully remember what happened. They had always explained that the fire started unexpectedly, maybe from an electrical problem, or something as random as a spark from the fireplace. Whatever the reason, it didn't matter, because she had made it out, and that was the most important part of the story. The fire had affected their family deeply. After it happened, her parents became extra protective of her. They never really spoke much about the fire, only that she should be grateful for being alive. Emily often overheard her parents talking quietly at night. Sometimes she could hear the worry in their voices, but they never seemed to go into details. Her father would reassure her mother, saying that everything was fine now, and that they had moved on from the tragedy. Yet there were always small hints that something had been left unsaid. Growing up, Emily had a mixture of emotions regarding the fire. On one hand, she was thankful that she was alive and well. On the other hand, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the story than her parents were telling her. Whenever she asked about it, they would gently remind her that she was too young to understand and that it was a painful topic. So Emily stopped asking. She learned to accept the parts of the story her parents shared, and the rest of the details faded into the background. It wasn't until Emily reached her teenage years that the questions about the fire started to resurface. She began to notice things. Little things. For example, her parents avoided talking about certain details of the fire, and whenever she brought it up, the conversation would quickly change. It was as if they were trying to protect her from something, but Emily didn't know what. She wondered why the fire had such a powerful hold over them, even though so many years had passed. She wanted to know more, but she never felt brave enough to press them for answers. It was easier to live with the belief that it had been just a tragic accident, and that was the end of it. But deep down, something inside Emily knew that there was more to the story. As the years went by, Emily found herself trying to move past the fire. Her parents had tried to shield her from the pain, and over time she started to believe that it was just something she had to accept. She focused on her schoolwork, her friendships, and her hobbies. She found joy in simple things: reading books, taking long walks in the park, and spending time with her friends. But no matter how busy or happy she was, there were moments when the fire would creep back into her thoughts, like an unanswered question lingering in the back of her mind. Her childhood was filled with love, and her parents always seemed to want the best for her. They made sure she had everything she needed: school supplies, birthday parties, and trips to the beach. They worked hard to give her a normal life despite the tragic past. Emily felt safe in her home and was surrounded by a sense of warmth that only a family could provide. Yet in her quieter moments, when she was alone with her thoughts, the memories of the fire seemed to follow her, as if they were waiting for the right moment to be remembered. As she entered high school, Emily grew more independent. She started making her own decisions about her life, choosing her friends, exploring different interests, and developing a sense of who she was. But the questions about the fire never fully disappeared. She began to wonder if her life would always have this gap in it, a missing puzzle piece that she couldn't quite place. Emily's relationship with her parents was mostly good, but there was a certain distance that had grown between them. They were loving and supportive, but there was something unsaid. Emily started to sense that there was a wall between them, something they weren't sharing. It wasn't a barrier of anger or resentment, but rather one of secrecy, one that made her feel like an outsider in her own family. Every time she tried to talk about the fire, her parents would shift uncomfortably, changing the subject or offering vague reassurances. They would tell her, "It's all in the past now. There's no need to dwell on it." But Emily couldn't help it. The older she got, the more curious she became. She wanted to understand her past, to piece together the story that had shaped her. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the fire than she had been told. Why was it so painful for her parents to discuss? Why did they seem so guarded whenever she asked about it? These questions simmered in her mind, even though she tried not to dwell on them too much. One day, when Emily was about 15, she decided to ask her mother about the fire again. She had heard rumors from some of her friends about fires that were started intentionally, fires that had a deeper cause than mere accidents. But every time she brought it up, her mother would give her a quick, reassuring answer, saying it was just a bad memory they didn't need to revisit. Emily respected her mother's wishes, but the nagging feeling that something was being hidden never left. It was during these years that Emily began to understand that some truths, no matter how painful, had a way of staying hidden. She knew that when the time was right, the answers would come. But until then, she tried her best to focus on what she could control: her schoolwork, her friendships, and her dreams for the future. Still, in the back of her mind, the fire remained an unsolved mystery. One quiet afternoon, Emily sat with her mother in the kitchen, watching her prepare dinner. The warm smell of stew filled the room, and for a moment, everything felt perfectly normal. But as the sound of the chopping knife echoed through the space, Emily's thoughts wandered. The curiosity she had tried to bury about the fire resurfaced, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to know more. Something about the way her parents had always told the story felt incomplete. She had to ask again, even if it meant stirring up uncomfortable emotions. "Mom," she began, trying to sound casual, "I've been thinking a lot about the fire lately. You know, the one when I was little." Her mother paused for a moment, her hands frozen midair as she reached for a spice jar. Emily could see the shift in her face, the way her expression tightened slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Sweetheart, we've been through this," her mother said softly, placing the jar back on the shelf. She didn't meet Emily's gaze. It was just an accident, something no one could have predicted. Emily bit her lip, fighting the growing frustration inside. She didn't want to push too hard, but the words felt hollow. "But why does it always feel like there's more to it? Every time I ask, it's the same answer. It's like there's something you're not telling me." Her mother sighed and turned away from the counter, resting her hands on the edge of the kitchen sink. "It's just painful to talk about, Emily. That's all. You don't need to know everything." Her voice was gentle but firm, as if she had already made up her mind about the conversation. For a moment, Emily felt a pang of guilt. She knew her mother didn't want to relive those painful memories, but the unanswered questions inside her were growing louder, harder to ignore. She tried one last time, her voice trembling with a mix of determination and vulnerability. "Mom, please, I need to understand. Why don't you want to tell me the truth? I just want to know what really happened." Her mother paused again, and for the first time in years, Emily saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Hesitation, uncertainty, even fear. It was only for a brief moment, but it was enough to make Emily feel like she was finally on the verge of learning something important. But before Emily could say anything more, her mother quickly turned back to the stove, busying herself with stirring the pot. "It's not the right time, Emily. You're not ready for this." Emily's heart sank, and she felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to argue, to demand more answers, but she couldn't. There was a part of her that still wanted to protect her mother, to keep the peace in their home. So she stayed silent, feeling the strange mixture of disappointment and resignation wash over her. The conversation had ended before it could even really begin. But as Emily sat there, quietly watching her mother finish dinner, something inside her shifted. The determination that had been growing inside her all these years, the drive to find the truth, began to feel more like a need, something she couldn't ignore any longer. She knew deep down that the answers weren't going to come from her mother. She would have to search for them herself, and somehow that realization made her more determined than ever. The truth was out there, and Emily was ready to find it, no matter what it took. After that conversation with her mother, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she had to dig deeper. The words her mother had said were still fresh in her mind, but it was the look in her eyes, the hesitation, the fear that stuck with her the most. She knew her mother wasn't being honest, but why? What was the truth behind the fire? She couldn't let it go, not now. Emily had to understand what had really happened, even if it meant uncovering things she wasn't ready for. Over the next few days, she decided to take matters into her own hands. Emily wasn't one to back down, and she knew if she was going to find the truth, she would need to dig a little deeper. She began with small steps. She looked through old family photo albums and scrapbooks, hoping to find any pictures or notes that might offer a clue. There were pictures from when she was a baby, some of her parents holding her after the fire, but nothing that gave any clear answers. Then she turned to the internet. Emily searched for news articles about fires in their town around the time of the incident. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she knew she had to start somewhere. The more she searched, the more frustrated she became. There was no mention of any fire that matched the details of hers. It was as though the whole thing had been erased from public memory. Maybe it wasn't as simple as an accident after all. One afternoon, while searching through old family documents, Emily came across something that caught her eye. It was an old letter, yellowed with age, tucked inside a drawer in her father's desk. She had never seen it before, and the handwriting wasn't her father's. It was addressed to her mother. Her curiosity piqued. Emily carefully opened the envelope and read the letter. It was short and cryptic, but it sent a chill down her spine. The letter mentioned something about payback and warned her mother to be careful, suggesting that there were people who wouldn't forgive them for what happened. The letter was dated a few months before the fire. Emily's hands trembled as she finished reading. The letter didn't make much sense, but it was clear that it was connected to the fire. Her heart raced. She couldn't understand what it all meant, but she knew she had found something important. There was a story behind this letter, a story her parents had kept hidden for years. The discovery made Emily feel both excited and uneasy. She had found a clue, but it only raised more questions. Who wrote the letter? What did they mean by payback? And why had her parents kept this from her? She needed more answers, and she was determined to find them. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but there were still so many gaps in the story. That evening, Emily decided to reach out to a few people who might know more about what happened. She called an old family friend, someone who had been close to her parents during that time. She hoped they could shed some light on the situation, even though she wasn't sure how much they knew. She had no idea that this simple phone call would set her on a path that would change everything she thought she knew about her past. When Emily called her family friend, Mrs. Thompson, she wasn't sure what to expect. Mrs. Thompson had known her parents for years and had always been a part of their lives, even after the fire. Emily remembered her as kind and always willing to share a cup of tea and a comforting word, but she had never discussed the fire with her. She was hesitant, but the curiosity pushing her forward made her dial the number. "Hello, Emily." Mrs. Thompson's warm voice came through the phone, and Emily felt a mix of relief and anxiety. She had always trusted Mrs. Thompson, but now she wasn't sure what she was about to uncover. "Hi, Mrs. Thompson. I hope I'm not disturbing you," Emily said, trying to keep her tone casual. "I've been thinking a lot about the fire, you know, the one from when I was a little girl, and I was wondering if you could help me understand what really happened." There was a long pause on the other end. Emily held her breath, waiting for Mrs. Thompson's response. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost hesitant. "The fire, Emily. I'm not sure it's something you want to dig into," Mrs. Thompson said carefully. Your parents have always been protective of you, and for good reason. The truth, it's complicated, but if you really want to know, I'll help you, as much as I can. Emily's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. Please, Mrs. Thompson, I need to know. There are so many things that don't make sense to me, and I feel like I'm only getting part of the story. Another long pause followed. Emily could hear Mrs. Thompson's deep sigh, as though she was weighing the decision carefully. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady, but heavy with the weight of the words she was about to say. All right, Emily, I'll tell you what I know. But you need to understand that some things are better left buried. Your parents, they've been hiding the truth from you, but it's not out of malice. It's because they love you, and they wanted to protect you from the truth. Emily sat up straighter, her grip tightening on the phone. What truth? She asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath before continuing. The fire wasn't an accident, Emily. It was set on purpose. Someone wanted to hurt your family, your parents. They had been involved in a conflict with a neighbor over land. The fire was meant to intimidate them, to make them back down. But it got out of control, and things went horribly wrong. Emily's mind raced as she absorbed the words. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she felt as if the ground beneath her was shifting. The fire, the thing that had shaped so much of her life, had been a deliberate act. Her parents had never mentioned any conflict with a neighbor, only that it had been a terrible accident. I don't understand, Emily said, her voice shaking. Why would someone want to hurt us like that? And why didn't you ever tell me? Mrs. Thompson's voice was softer now, almost apologetic. Your parents wanted to keep you safe, Emily. They didn't want you to know the details, because they knew it would change how you saw them. They were ashamed. They thought they could handle it, that they could protect you from the full weight of what happened. But it's time you knew the truth. Your parents didn't cause the fire, but they were part of a larger story, and that's something you need to understand. Emily felt a rush of emotions, anger, confusion, disbelief, but also a strange sense of clarity. The pieces were beginning to fit together, and while the truth was painful, it was also the key to understanding her past. But there was still more to uncover. The questions kept piling up. Who had started the fire? How deep did the conflict go? And how had her parents managed to keep it hidden for all these years? I'll help you, Emily, Mrs. Thompson added, her voice comforting despite the difficult news. But you'll have to be ready for what comes next. It won't be easy. Emily took a deep breath, feeling a mix of relief and uncertainty. I'm ready, Mrs. Thompson. Thank you. As the conversation ended, Emily knew that her journey was just beginning. The truth was no longer something to fear. It was something she had to face. And she was determined to uncover every last detail, no matter where it led her. The conversation with Mrs. Thompson left Emily feeling a strange mixture of emotions. Her mind was racing, and her thoughts were tangled. She had learned more in those few minutes than in the entire span of her life. The fire was not just a random accident. It had been caused by a conflict, and her family had been part of something far bigger than she had ever realized. She felt a wave of anger toward her parents for keeping the truth from her, but at the same time, she could understand why they had tried to protect her. They hadn't wanted her to carry the burden of the past. But now that she knew, the questions seemed to grow even more. Who had started the fire? Why hadn't her parents told her about the neighbor they were in conflict with? And how much danger had they been in? Emily knew she couldn't ignore these questions anymore. There was still so much more to uncover, and she was determined to get to the bottom of it. The next morning, Emily felt like she had a new purpose. She could no longer sit back and wait for the answers to come to her. She had to seek them out herself. She started by visiting the old house where the fire had happened. It wasn't easy for her to go back. There were so many memories tied to that place, both good and bad. But she needed to see it again. She needed to understand what had happened and how it had affected her family. When she arrived, the house looked exactly as she remembered it. though it had been years since the fire. The front door, once charred and blackened, had been replaced. The windows, now new and clear, didn't bear any trace of the destruction that had once been there. Still, standing in front of it, Emily felt a chill run down her spine. The memories were overwhelming. She walked around the perimeter of the house, trying to imagine what had happened that night. The fear, the chaos, the loss. But it wasn't just the house she wanted to examine. It was everything around it. She looked at the other homes in the neighborhood, hoping to see something that would offer a clue. That's when she noticed the house next door. It was a modest two-story building that seemed to have been abandoned for years. The lawn was overgrown, and the windows were covered in dust. There was something unsettling about it. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she remembered Mrs. Thompson's words. The fire had been connected to a neighbor, someone they had been in conflict with. Could this be the house? With a mix of nervousness and determination, Emily decided to approach the house. She walked up to the front gate and peered inside. The property was locked up tight, but there was a small window near the back that she could see through. Her eyes scanned the area, hoping for a sign, something that would give her more information about the past. As she stood there, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The air around her felt heavy, as though something was waiting to happen. Just as she was about to turn away, a voice startled her. "What are you doing here?" Emily spun around, her heart racing. Standing in front of her was a man she didn't recognize. He looked like he was in his mid-30s, with a weathered face and a look in his eyes that made her feel uneasy. There was something about him that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. I'm just looking around," Emily stammered. "I used to live here, and I wanted to see the house again." The man studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "I've been here for a while," he said. "This place isn't what it seems. You don't want to know what happened here." Emily's curiosity surged. "What do you mean?" "I need to know what happened to my family. Can you help me?" For a moment, the man seemed to hesitate, as if he were debating whether or not to share what he knew. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I don't know if you're ready to hear the truth, but if you really want to know, I can tell you what happened that night. But be careful, some things are better left in the past." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. The answers were finally within reach, but she knew that the truth might change everything. She nodded slowly, her mind already racing with possibilities. "I'm ready," she said. "Tell me what you know." The man looked around, as if checking to see if anyone was watching, before motioning for Emily to follow him. She took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to hear could shatter everything she thought she knew about her past. But she couldn't turn back now. She had to know the truth, no matter the cost. The man led Emily to the side of the house, where a faded wooden bench sat under a large, overgrown tree. He motioned for her to sit, and she did, her mind buzzing with anticipation. She didn't know who he was, or what he knew, but she had a feeling that he was about to reveal something that would completely change her understanding of the fire and her family's past. He sat down beside her, his face serious and tense. For a long moment, he didn't speak, and Emily felt the weight of the silence pressing down on her. She could hear the distant rustling of leaves and the chirping of birds, but her thoughts were far away, focused entirely on what he was about to say. Finally, he spoke in a low, gravelly voice. "Your parents were involved in something much bigger than you know. The fire, it wasn't just an accident, like they've always told you. It was part of a plan. A warning. And that neighbor you're asking about, he wasn't just some angry man. He had ties to some dangerous people. People who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What kind of people? And why didn't my parents tell me any of this?" The man exhaled deeply, clearly weighing his words. "Your parents were scared. They didn't want to drag you into this, and they thought they could protect you from the truth. But I've known them for a long time. I saw things. Things that don't add up. The man who lived next door, his name was Paul Green. He wasn't just a regular guy. He was in deep with some powerful people, people who were willing to destroy everything in their path to get what they wanted. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. But why my family? What did we have to do with them? The man glanced around nervously before leaning in slightly. Your parents bought this house from Paul Green's family. It was a small piece of land that his family had fought to hold onto for years, and when your parents moved in, they didn't know what they were stepping into. Green's family had a lot of enemies, criminals, corrupt businessmen, people who didn't play by the rules. They thought your parents had taken something that wasn't theirs, and when they couldn't get the land back through normal means, they resorted to other methods. Emily felt as if the ground beneath her was shaking. You mean the fire wasn't just about the house, it was about the land? Yes, the man said quietly. It was about power, control. There were people who believed that your family was standing in their way. They thought if they destroyed your home, they could intimidate your parents into giving up. But it didn't go as planned. They didn't expect you to survive. They thought the fire would make your family back down, but it only made your parents more determined to protect you. Emily's mind was spinning. So the fire, it was a threat. Exactly, the man said, his voice dark. It was meant to send a message. They wanted your parents to know that they were not untouchable, that no one was safe, but instead of scaring them, it brought them closer together. Your parents were never the same after that night. They became more secretive, more protective. They did everything they could to keep you out of harm's way. But why didn't they tell me the truth? Emily asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of frustration and hurt. Why didn't they ever let me know what really happened? The man looked at her, his expression softened by a touch of sympathy. They didn't want you to live in fear. They thought that if you knew the truth, it would change how you saw the world, how you saw them. They didn't want you to think of them as weak, or as people who were caught in something bigger than themselves. They wanted you to have a normal life. But that wasn't possible. The fire was just the beginning. Emily felt a mix of anger and confusion bubbling inside her. All these years, her parents had kept her in the dark, and she couldn't help but feel betrayed. But at the same time, she understood why they had done it. They were trying to protect her, to give her a chance at a normal life. But now, the truth was finally out, and there was no going back. What happened to Paul Green? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Where is he now? The man hesitated, his eyes darting to the ground. Paul Green is gone. After the fire, he disappeared. Some say he skipped town, others say he was dealt with by the people he owed money to. But no one knows for sure. What matters now is that your family made it out, and they fought to keep you safe. Emily sat in silence, letting the weight of the revelation settle in. She had never imagined that her family's story was so complicated, so full of secrets. But now, with the truth in front of her, she realized that the fire wasn't just a tragic accident. It was a pivotal moment in her family's history, a moment that had changed everything. The past was finally becoming clear. As the man finished telling Emily about the fire and the people involved, a heavy silence fell between them. Emily sat there, her mind reeling. She had spent years wondering about the fire, believing it to be a random accident. Now, everything had changed. The truth was so much more complicated than she could have imagined, and it shook her to her core. She had always felt like there was something missing, but she never could have guessed that it would be such a dark and dangerous secret. Your parents never wanted you to know any of this, the man said, his voice soft but firm. They did what they thought was best, even if it meant lying to you. They wanted you to have a safe and peaceful life, free from the chaos that their decisions brought into your family. Emily nodded slowly, still processing the information. She could feel the weight of it all pressing down on her chest. She understood why her parents had kept the truth from her. They had only wanted to protect her. But that didn't change the fact that she had been kept in the dark for so long. She had never known the full story, and now it felt like her entire understanding of her past had been turned upside down. The man stood up, brushing the dirt from his pants. "I think that's all you need to know for now," he said. "You've learned the truth, and that's a heavy burden to carry. But you don't need to keep digging. Sometimes, the past is better left buried." Emily stared at the ground for a long moment, trying to decide what to do with everything she had just learned. The fire had been a turning point in her family's history, a moment that had shaped everything she had known up until now. She thought about her parents, their love for her, the way they had always tried to protect her. They hadn't wanted her to carry the burden of their past, and in some ways, she understood that. But now, she had to decide what to do with the truth. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. "I don't know if I can forgive everything that's happened, but I appreciate you being honest with me." The man gave her a small, understanding nod. "You'll figure it out. Just remember, the past doesn't define who you are. It shapes you, yes, but it doesn't have to control your future. You've got your own life to live now, Emily. Don't let this shadow follow you forever." As he turned and walked away, Emily stayed seated on the bench, deep in thought. His words echoed in her mind. The past didn't have to control her future. She had the power to choose who she wanted to be, despite the secrets and lies that had surrounded her. She stood up, taking one last look at the house next door. The house where so much of her past had been shaped. It felt strange, like she was finally saying goodbye to a version of herself that had never really known the truth. It wasn't just about the fire anymore. It was about reclaiming her own story, about moving forward with a clearer understanding of what had happened and what she could do next. With a deep breath, Emily turned and walked away, the sun beginning to set behind her. She didn't know exactly what the future held, but she felt a sense of clarity. The truth had come to light, and while it had been painful, it had also freed her. She was no longer bound by the mystery of the fire, nor by the secrets her parents had kept. She was ready to build her own path, one that was no longer defined by the shadows of the past. The journey wasn't over, but Emily knew that she could face whatever came next. She had the truth, and with it, the strength to move forward.